Do you have a microphone?
I'd like to congratulate both teams on making the quarterfinal round of 2008 Apple National Championship. Strictly to time, this gentleman will be keeping track, so when he starts counting, that's when you know that we'll all start counting. So please keep your time. Representing the government today will be Princeton A, and representing the opposition will be Harvard BB. Their candidates from MIT, Adam Goldstein, from Johns Hopkins, John Baker. From Yale, Dave Denton and Matt Wansley, and I'm Chris Ford, formerly of William & Mary. If both sides are prepared, then I will call this House to order and ask the Right Honorable Prime Minister to rise and deliver a sentiment speech on a motion of choice.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Of course, it's an honor to be here. Currently, the United States criminal justice system is broken. The poor and ethnic minorities receive far longer sentences, higher conviction rates than do the white or the wealthy. And a recent Bureau of Justice Statistics report suggests that this is strongly correlated to the use of public defenders. So we are going to propose a novel way to solve this inequity. Now, in the status quo, defendants in criminal trials have a right to legal representation. For those who cannot afford it, the service is provided free of charge by public defenders. However, individuals may waive this service in order to hire their own legal representation. Our case is very simple. Everyone should be required to use a government-provided defense attorney for the trial level. For those who cannot afford it, it will be provided free of charge, and in all other cases, individuals will have to pay a fee based on their ability to pay and on the cost of providing the service. It will be a means-tested fee, relatively reflecting the sort of progressivity of whatever the income tax happens to be. But we think that attorneys then will be assigned to cases on a merit-based system, sort of like what's happening in the status quo, where lawyers with the best track records are given the most high-profile cases. To that end, we have three independent goals. Our first regards protecting the least well-off. We think that allowing the wealthy to buy legal representation directly hurts the poor. We think this is so for a couple of reasons. Firstly, this raises the price of legal representation. Effectively, the wealthy are, as a class, create a monopsony and distort the market-clearing price for representation. This is particularly true for attorneys because the high stakes in these situations create an exploitatively asymmetrical bargaining relationship between attorney and client. As a result, the wealthy will give up almost any amount of money to their legal defense teams to ensure that they don't go to prison for the rest of their life. Traditionally, governmental intervention is considered justifiable in these cases of market failure just like this. But we would also say that the wealthy's consumption reduces the supply of legal representation. This means that the best legal minds in the country are working to serve the highly correlated interests of a narrow demographic in a way that doesn't necessarily benefit anyone else. Moreover, this also leaves the worst lawyers for the poorest. We know this is the case because the poorest end up getting the longer sentences, are more likely to be involved in plea bargains, and have dramatically higher conviction rates. And these correlate very strongly with the use of public defenders. We think that this trend is furthermore self-reinforcing. As a lack of success of public defenders, lowers the prestige of the profession, driving other lawyers away. Furthermore, this lack of success reinforces the common conception that public defenders are only defend society's lowest and the most guilty, which raises not just a prestige concern, but an ethical concern for many lawyers that drives them further out of the profession. Our system allows these lawyers to defend the wealthy, the prestigious, and particularly the people who are most likely to be innocent, and as a result, we think increases the prestige accordingly. Now, normally, we don't permit one individual or group total control over a certain resource when it's harmful to the rest of society, particularly when it's harmful to the least well-off. We think this is because democracy is fundamentally premised on the principle of equal access to rights. Thus, we may permissively restrain certain rights when they obstruct others' ability to access those same rights in a comparable manner. This is the analogy we look to construct here is first to price controls. In situations of dire need, Bill Gates isn't permitted to run around buying up all the necessities and hoarding them to drive up the price. We can also draw another analogy to why we have laws prohibiting hate speech, because we believe to a certain extent that hate speech chills other protected speech. In other words, my ability to say incredibly hurtful and hateful things about you is believed to restrain your ability to exercise your right to speak back, and as we restrain the exercise of those sorts of rights. I think I'll get to after the video. More generally, though, we constrain the rights of the abilities of individuals to make certain choices about how to exercise their rights, when the exercise of some of these rights lead to less access of the self-same rights for others. And that's a principle we're proud to stand on today.
Sure. We give everyone a right to free speech. Should we therefore stop people who choose to buy a billboard and hence enhance their free speech through their extra wealth?
So, right. I think the difference here is that when we're talking about issues of legal representation, these are rights that are very difficult to access on your own. Consequently, we think that because the rights are so important, and they have such a high bar to access, we think it's very important that these people have a relatively equivalent right to be able to access these sorts of rights. Our second independent point regards the purpose of the criminal justice system. We think that firstly, private attorneys create asymmetry in the courtroom. We think that public defenders are notoriously under-equipped relative to lawyers for hire. Moreover, they often must contend with significant political and bureaucratic constraints that lawyers for hire do not, which means it's much difficult for them to try these cases. We also think that lawyers for hire have powerful incentives to deliver a not guilty verdict that public defenders find. Lawyers for hire are only as good as the verdict they produce, and there's a direct correlation here with their future income, so they have powerful incentives to make sure they get these people off. We also think that lawyers for hire generally have more time to focus on the case and are rewarded on a case-by-case basis, not simply on the amount of cases that they prosecute in the long term. So we think that's a big problem for them as well. Well, additionally, we would say under this, that the fact that these different incentives undermines the function of the adversarial system as a truth-seeking mechanism. Now, our system only functions when both sides of the dispute are equally well equipped. When these two perspectives clash, so the idea goes, the truth will emerge as that which persists. Each falsehood that emerges will be disregarded until only the truth remains. Now, when there is a disparity between the competing sides, however, falsity may persist or overwhelm the truth, and we think that undermines the ability of our adversarial system to function. We think this inequity is further exacerbated by the fact that the body that is designed to distinguish between Joe Schmo, the district attorney, and Alan Dershowitz is a jury, which are notoriously subject to emotive appeals and lack oversight when they're constructing their decisions. So much so that people regularly hire entire firms to simply do consulting based on jury selection and jury bias. We'd also say that this inequity effectively creates a two-tier justice system, because individuals who use public defenders receive, on average, more convictions, longer sentences. This sets up a pernicious and public hierarchy between the rich and the poor. And given the disproportionate number of ethnic and racial minorities who are impoverished, this also creates the perception that certain social groups are more criminal or less worthy of protection. We think this also creates the perception that the criminal justice system is a tool for the wealthy to oppress the weak and the poor, which is bad. And we furthermore think this exacerbates the current perception that greater liberty is a corollary to greater wealth, which further diminishes the status of the poor in a way that we think is only harmful. Our third and final independent point regards fixing the broken system, because we think that allowing the wealthy to effectively opt out of criminal punishments demolishes the political will to repair this currently broken system. Forcing the wealthy to utilize public defenders will motivate them to dedicate their financial and political capital to ensuring the system is as effective as possible. Now, in the current system, the wealthy have a vested interest in maintaining that inequity, maintaining the current inequity, as it further enables them to escape prosecution. In other situations where the wealthy are allowed to opt out, such as public schooling or public health care, there's been a marked decline in the services provided to the bottom half. Now, without the whole of society advocating for reform, we think many abuses will also go unnoticed, as they affect the people who are already largely disenfranchised and largely disconnected from the sorts of media networks that we need to report these sorts of abuses. And these abuses ripple through the criminal justice system. They, for example, the lack of politically powerful people in prison make prison reform harder, or creates a sort of hierarchical structure where parasites can get special treatment. Now, since the wealthy already have access to the most powerful political networks and capital, we think that the changes that they are capable of effectuating will be more effective and longer lasting than if promoted otherwise, when promoted through some sort of indirect way. The final thing we would say under this is that we think that this promotes egalitarianism in society broadly. We think that forcing the wealthy to be treated on par with the poor will encourage them to adopt more egalitarian approaches elsewhere. We think, firstly, this undermines their ability to otherwise dehumanize them. And we think this also creates a shared body of experiences that inextricably ties them all to the rest of society. We think that this shared body of experiences will reduce antipathy among the poor and foster greater future cooperation, as it encourages people to think that we are all in this together and that we all have the same interest in promoting the good through the same unitary system. For these reasons, we are very proud of it.
The first speech from Officer Schmidt is called Clear Opposition to Belzer, the speech not proceeding.
We have 5 arguments for you. The first of which is the idea of why this breaks the adversarial competition in a really bad way. Right? The idea of lawyers is not being controlled on both sides by the state is pretty crucial, insofar as you don't want the state to own the contest altogether. That means you can rig the contest. That is to say, biases infect the contest. We're not okay with that on this side of the house. And we say that adversarial attorneys, especially the preservation of private interests in those attorneys, assures always some check on the idea that the state can't ensure that kind of rigging. That's an obvious point. That's the first thing I had to say. The second has to be the idea of exactly the consultants, which they mentioned. We were really glad they mentioned consultants, because nothing changes on this side of the house. 2 possibilities of how consultants could be used. First, individuals could shirk the entire idea of even using a public hired attorney, just self-defend while paying a consultant on the side. Rich people could do that. Secondly, even public defense attorneys who hope to win within their trials could simply hire another consultant firm to back them through their rich clients anyway. So both the public attorneys or individuals not even using attorneys can use consultants. All impacts are gone. Third, they tell us that the rich are really important people here, and all of a sudden they're the most important people that we need to target in the round. Reason why the rich aren't going to do this. Because they're not going to do this. What will happen if you look at a legislative process in this side of the House? It's only going to be overturned. The rich will recognize what's in their interests. The legal system, backed by the consultant stuff that I just talked about, is obviously going to turn into the rich. So you can't even value this as a philosophy unless you note that in practice it's not going to survive. So all of the impacts of a legal philosophy, which requires the legal philosophy actually being implemented, won't occur at the point at which you recognize the inevitability of the overturning of the cycle. The fourth argument here is the idea of why justice is more than just what they say in their first point, a market failure, and why justice isn't a market, but rather the idea of truth. Now, I know it's hard to believe that rich, better attorneys who happen to have gone to better schools might often be more accurate in their overturning of information, despite the fact that they might not be working in the poor's interests. I know that's hard to believe, but it's usually true that those better attorneys are more likely to give us true information. What do? They don't increase truth on the justice side, they just increase chaos, where both attorneys are so stupid that you get a result that isn't any more true, but fairer. So it's kind of a sham justice, right? It's fair in that both sides are retarded and have retarded attorneys. But you haven't actually got a just result where justice has anything at all to do with truth. The fifth argument is this idea of the mass exodus from the legal system where attorneys get paid shit all, right? We say that some attorneys occasionally are willing to bite this harm, like my sweet daddy. But not everyone is so sweet as David Belser. He has this adorable little pot belly. The point is only, right, that some attorneys, some of the best minds won't go into the business. Most of the best minds. I'll cross-apply this as I get to their case, where they talk about why it's so important that we do preserve the best minds in the system. So get right to their case. The very first argument is that the least well off, right? That's the target here, right? Poor people are really crucial, and this is raising the bar to entry, right? I think you obviously cross-apply the very second point that I give you, this consultant idea, both sides of it. That is to say, individuals can still shirk the idea of lawyers altogether, or the lawyers through their clients can just be backed by consultant firms anyway. There's no reason that the idea of the defense won't be supplemented here, that there won't still be an imbalance. Furthermore, I would add that even within the adversarial system, inevitable imbalance occurs, right? One lawyer is going to be better than the other. What happens when that occurs? The biases which they can't get rid of and can't address, biases in juries, racism that's already in society, take over. That is to say, their case doesn't address anything, but only mars the system, lowers the standard of truth, but doesn't solve the inevitability of imbalance in society anyway. Their second argument is this idea that, we want the best minds all together, right? Cross-apply my idea about the mass exodus from the system. They're not going to have better quality of minds, and I'll take you in 1 second. They're going to have a lower standard in the first place, of which there's a lower probability that you're going to have smarter people. But on top of that, the best minds will still be paid to be helping the defense of public attorneys through the rich people, so there's no change. Go ahead.
So in the status quo, we already see a mass exodus from the public defense system, which really screws over the poor. On our side of the house, we have a means test which allows us to get far more funding for the system, so we can actually have competitive wages for the lawyers who want to do it.
All right, so that's where you work on the margins, right? You're actually doing your job as comparing. We'll talk about comparison right in a second, because the one thing that breaks this is the idea of rights, and why that marginal difference isn't entitled to by any of the citizens in the state, because there isn't a right to a certain extent of speech. We'll talk about that in just 1 second. He then says that, this hurts the idea of public defense, that the public defense attorney is like this ethical person and stuff like that. Well, first of all, we would say that those willing to go into the public defense field are already going to go into the public defense field anyway. They're doing it because they don't care. But we would say, ultimately, this idea of changing perceptions of public defense attorneys is the silliest argument I've ever heard. We should vote for the government because we don't like it that David Belser has to walk down downtown in Asheville and look like a grubby little asshole who defends public defense attorneys for no money, right? Are you all so convicted about that you really want to change the perception of my dad? No thanks. I think no one really cares except me about David Belser because he's a public defense attorney. So this is a silly argument. All right, so but here's a really important point. This idea of the rights to speech, right? And this is crucial. This is why the marginal benefits to the idea of equity, the idea of requiring people to be given public defense attorneys don't go this side of the house. Because they're not entitled to that benefit. Here's the idea, right? Yes, we have a right to speech, which is why everyone gets at least an attorney, right? Through which they can speak, a voice box. There is no right to a megaphone, however. At that point, nor is there a right to take away the megaphone of a guy who actually bought it because he was rich and awesome and wanted World War II because he was even richer than awesome. So we say on this side of the house that there's a real reason to believe that every so often imbalance is a natural product of the way things go. That there's no reason or right to imbalance the imbalance in the first place and hope that a negative of a negative equals the altogether truth that they'll never get on this side of the house. No thanks. Then they say, well, what you're going to have is this problem with lawyers for hire, right? And all of a sudden, there are all these issues with with prosecutorial discretion and the notion of lawyers actually being employed for a specific reason. But here's the problem, right? They don't ever solve for any of these problems because they're not actually increasing the quality of the verdict. They're just lowering the standards. We all read like Harrison Bergeron, right? This isn't a better society. It's just a crappier one that happens coincidentally to be equally crappy for everyone, right? Just because the rich could afford to find the truth on their side didn't mean the poor didn't also have a true verdict somewhere. On this side of the house, there's no truth, just bumbling idiots who happen to end up in the service of the state who's marring the decision in the first place because they have complete control over the whole fucking deal. We say that's really bad. The final argument then is this idea that juries are emotive. And this is my favorite point. Here's where we have to vote for the out, right? Because they've never solved for this. Remember what I told you at the very beginning of our points, right? That even if we admitted that somehow this equality existed, no matter what, one public defense attorney appointed by the state is going to be a little different from the other. One will inevitably be a tiny bit better. At least most of the time there will be skill sets that will win over another. What happens in those situations? This fact that they point out, a fact which they don't remedy, takes over. Which is to say, they don't actually solve for anything because the jury's emotiveness is always going to be preclusive of any of the impacts they argue for. No thanks. They don't argue that we can somehow remedy racism. They don't argue that we can somehow get rid of emotionalism. So at the end of the day, not only will consultants be able to seize upon the same emotion with better rhetoric anyway, which you have to buy because it's true, and we value truth on this side of the house. But secondly, it doesn't matter anyway because the same biases still exist. So I think for all of these reasons, you're very clearly looking at an op. This is the first time in my life I've been under time, and it's because I was so right. Thanks a lot.
Well, a member of government will tell certain deliberations teach not to consider.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, for recognizing me, members of this panel for coming out. Truly honored to once again be speaking in the quarterfinals of the national championships. Friends on side ops, spirited opposition, most august house, thank you for coming out. Equal pounding for both sides, please. So the first idea we get from the leader of opposition is that we break the adversarial system because the government controls the entire process. The problem with this is it seems like the state already controls the entire process for the poor. If so, that's really bad for the poor on their side of the house by their own argumentation. If this is such a great harm that the state is appointing for the defense and for the prosecution, then the poor are really fucked by their own argumentation. But secondly, though, we would say that this isn't such a problem. That if it is a problem, that if it does look like you are not getting good attorneys into the system, then on our side of the house, where the rich are not insulated from the problems of the public defense system, then they will be motivated to vote for change to that system to get rid of that problem. And we'll go into that more later. The second idea we get is a really silly idea about there will still be consultants. We don't get rid of consultants. The first idea under this is that the rich will defend themselves with consultants on the side. Mr. Speaker, this is absolutely idiotic. If you don't know what you're doing in a criminal trial, standing up and reading notes prepared by a consultant is not going to win over any jury or any judge. You are going to lose, and this is a big problem for that argument. The next idea under this, no thank you, sir, is the idea that you will sort of use committees instead. That you will get, a public defender, and you'll have the committees feed money into him. The idea is that within this, you still maintain the incentive to change. Why spend $10 million on an outside committee if instead you can just get a good lawyer in the first place? Then you don't have to waste your wealth on that, and you have a fair system too. The third idea is sort of the idea of rights. The idea that you have a right to choose, a right for the rich to buy out. I have a number of responses to this. And the first is, why do you have a right to choose? We don't recognize a right to choose your representation in the status quo. If I want Johnny Cochran or Alan Dershowitz to defend me, and I can't afford him, I have no right to go up to Alan Dershowitz and say, come defend me. Instead, I have to settle for the Robbie Pratts at the bottom of the legal totem pole, and that really sucks for me because I have no money. The analogy we draw in this case is to the idea of the concept of an easement. Let's say that I own property out west and a stream runs through that property. So I have a right to the water in that stream. However, if there's a town downstream that is fed by that stream, I have no right to drink up all the water such that that town runs dry. That's what the system in the status quo does. The wealthy control absolutely the supply of good lawyers, leaving the poor with the shitty ones who are left. no, you don't have a right. We are fine curtailing the rights of the rich to do whatever they want when that directly and severely hurts the poor. The fourth and fifth ideas are basically the same, that we increase chaos on our side of the house because attorneys are stupid, and the fifth idea is that there will be a mass exodus of lawyers from the legal profession. A number of responses to this. The first is that we talk about this on case when we provide you a means test. We're going to say that the rich are still putting lots and lots of money into the system. Therefore, if money is what motivates you, you still have those higher salaries in the system to get good lawyers to join. Secondly, is that the prestige of the system does increase. I'm not quite sure what Belser is talking about when he says that this isn't a factor. But yes, ladies and gentlemen, there is an understanding in the system that if you join a public defense firm, you're either sort of a goody two-shoes with political ambitions, or you're just not good enough to get the high-paying job at the private firm in New York City. On our side of the house, we say that by joining the public defender system, you're just as likely to represent the poor crack-dealing murderer as you are to represent some other higher-end clients who are going to be found innocent. When you say that by entering the public defender system, that's how you represent the people in the court of law, that changes the prestige of the system in favor on our side of the house of getting more people into the system. Our third response to this is that if money is the only thing, we create the political will necessary for change on our side of the house. In the status quo, the rich are insulated from the problems of the public defender system. If a public defender falls asleep while you're on trial for murder, then you don't have access necessarily, because the poor just don't have as much access to political rights in the United States, to get change to that system. However, if the public defender falls asleep when it's Donald Trump or Paris Hilton on trial, then A, they have the media coverage to say, this is wacky, we have to do something about it, and B, they have political enfranchisement and access to rights in order to vote for change and get change. The analogy we draw, two analogies we draw, is comparing public schools in the Bronx with public schools in like Westchester, New York, or some other rich suburb. When the rich are in the same system, they have an incentive to pour money into that system so they get better services. A second idea is just healthcare in Europe. In Great Britain, where the rich have the same sort of healthcare as the poor do, they vote for higher taxes or other sorts of things in order to make sure the healthcare that they get is free. The fourth and final response to the idea of the mass exodus, the idea that attorneys will be stupid on our side of the house, is simply that we can use the means test to provide specific incentives to enter the public defender system. We can say, we'll use the money on our side of the house that we're raising in order to do things like perform debt forgiveness for law school. Say, we'll forgive your student loans if you served as a public defender for 5 years or something like that. Those are a number of key incentives we maintain to enter the public defender system on our side of the house, and we give you the political will necessary to achieve change on our side of the house. Sure, my man.
Yeah, because $40,000 worth of debt forgiveness will pay back a rich guy who would have paid millions where you're screwing him over entirely.
Okay, so I guess the idea here is that some people make millions. So, a number of responses. The first is that there are only a finite number of those positions in the status quo. There are very few people who actually go to law school expecting to make that $5 million payout. Once those positions are okay, well, Deb is one of them who will be making that $1 million payout. Probably everyone else on that panel too. But generally, across the entire United States, there are fewer of those. And once those positions are filled, we think that a sort of equilibrium will be reached, such that the positions are filled, people will go into the other professions, and if not enough people are entering those professions, the salaries will rise to compensate. The salaries will rise in order to draw more people into the system. That being said, going case side very briefly, I think Dave gave you lots of great arguments over and over. The first idea we talk about is protecting the least well off. We hear this idea that, speech, that I'm not entitled to, all the rights I wanted to. The government doesn't have to pay for a billboard for my right to speech. First, if I'm speaking on a megaphone so loud that no one else can be heard, yeah, the government can take away my goddamn megaphone. The analogy of this is campaign finance laws. I can't give $20 million to Barack Obama because that means that the $10 that Goldstein gives to Ron Paul means nothing. So yes, we do curtail certain rights in those instances. Secondly, I think it's fine to look at it within a consequentialist framework. If I don't get a billboard to say what I want, no real harm to me. If I don't get a good lawyer, I could get the electric chair, Mr. Speaker. For consequentialist reasons alone, we ought be fair in this allocation of resources. We also hear the idea that state has complete control. Cross-apply what I talked about off case. The last sort of real thing that Belser talks about is the idea of the emotive juries. What we tell you is that on our side of the house, when the best attorneys are assigned to both the rich and the poor, then yeah, the poor sometimes do get to take advantage of the fact that juries are emotive. The poor get good decisions in their favor, whereas in the status quo, they're almost uniformly screwed because the rich have a monopsony on the good lawyers. They have absolute control over the supply. On our side of the house, we change that such that we maintain the quality of legal representation, but we make sure that everyone in the system has access to it. That's why I'm so proud to propose.
I think the over remarks now the final constructive speech round to ask the member of the opposition to call and deliver a
Great. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. What we've seen from side government today is actually we have an imperfect situation for the poor, so we should also create an imperfect situation for the rich, and thus equality will be achieved. We don't think that's the way that we run things in society, that when we see something is screwed up, we try and screw it up for everyone else, so we have equitable screwed up outcomes. What we've got on the side of the house today, and we still haven't seen them interacting on this side, is that good lawyers can actually achieve a better outcome overall, irrespective of their client's interest. An outcome that does achieve something closer to the truth, and with that in mind, I want to go through these points. The first idea we told you was this idea of adversarial competition. We said it's an important aspect that the state doesn't control every aspect of the trial. And what they said in response was, but the state really does for the poor. And we tell you, first of all, that's because they recognise the fundamental imperfection of the system. Insofar as we would like the poor to be able to afford their own representation, but they simply can't because of their position in society, we recognise the need, due to these extenuating circumstances, to put a lesser than good situation and system in place. That's fine, we do pragmatic things all the time like that. But we tell you furthermore, as they said, this will change it for the rich, because the rich will have an incentive to change the entire system so that they will have a decent court. We say there are a couple of reasons why this won't happen. The first one is we think that it's a very, very large hurdle to get over to fix the entire legal system in this country. We think there are plenty of rich people out there who actually care about the poor, and it's something that they don't seem to sort of realise could be possible, but who, in spite of caring about the poor, haven't managed to fix the system. There are deeper structural roots behind this problem of public defenders not being adequately funded, one of which is that the general public doesn't want to adequately fund them because they have a view of criminals as bad people who should be put in jail regardless. We say insofar as you can't simply counteract those stereotypes, and they're not stereotypes just coming from the rich, they're stereotypes coming from plenty of middle-class people who can't afford particularly good lawyers. We say this is something that you have to overcome, that you can't simply overcome because the rich want to change this. We say insofar as that's the case, they have to recognise the possibility today that the rich won't actually be able to change the system. And that insofar as they recognise that they can still be buggered over in these court cases, they have to find ways to get around the system. That's why the second point that Ben made was so important. The idea that when you're looking for ways to get around the system, they leave you with thousands. They leave you first of all with the idea of hiring consultants, people who can take you to the very door of the courtroom, tell you every single thing to say, or better still, tell a semi-competent public defender every single thing to say. Indeed, tell you every way to get out of that courtroom successfully in a way that the poor simply can't afford. And they're so concerned with inequalities. Now, thank you, sir, on this side of the house, we say that that's not something that they're fundamentally adjusting for. They then kind of fall back on this idea again that they say, you know, when we came to this idea of justice, we told you that you don't necessarily, this isn't necessarily, you have a right to justice, not necessarily a right to a better attorney. And they said, well, why do you have this right to a better attorney? Why is this, you know, this inherent right? And we say, you need to show us today why there isn't this right to a better attorney. Insofar as we presuppose within society that people do have the right to better and further, essentially, their own interest when it comes to rights like speech, when it comes to rights like political representation through campaign contributions. And he came back to this absurd idea that I'll get to later of the campaign finance laws, where we say the very act of recognising that you can give campaign contributions recognises that we are putting a total ban on this kind of thing. What we say furthermore is this idea that when you actually come to having this right, that we think that insofar today as they're seeking to control any potential advantage that the rich could have, they need to tell us why they wouldn't also control things like the rich's hold over the media, where they wouldn't also control essentially anyone's ability to advantage themselves in any potential sphere where a public important right could be at stake. And then they had this fascinating analogy where they said, well, you have a right to water, but not a right to the water of someone else downstream. So it sounds like a Native American, like old wise saying. And we say in response that this is not a zero-sum scenario. We say insofar as you're taking this lawyer means that yes, you get him and the poor guy doesn't. The poor guy wasn't going to get him either. We say that what they do on their side of the house is they say, you can't take this lawyer, therefore he has to go and defend the poor. No, because they're not restricting every lawyer from being able to leave the legal profession. As Ben tells you, what this guy does when he can't anymore get his $10 million paycheck is he goes and becomes a legal consultant where he can get his $10 million paycheck. So insofar as essentially you are recycling the water off onto a different stream, you have achieved absolutely nothing on the side of the house. I don't know where this analogy goes. But what we then told you was this idea of a mass exodus from the legal profession. They had several responses. They said, first of all, the rich will still put in money. They'll still put, they'll still put money into the process. We say essentially, they say, the rich will still put money into ensuring the legal profession is properly done. The legal profession's money will simply go up. We say, no, the rich will redirect that money. They'll redirect it to things like consulting. There's a far greater opportunity cost for a lawyer going into this profession in the first case, insofar as they can now be a consultant ACDC.
In your view, why are the schools in Westchester better than the schools in the Bronx?
We think the schools in Westchester are better than the schools in the Bronx because you have a small homogeneous community whereby they know they can fix the schooling system because there are only rich people there. We say insofar as you're looking at the entire national legal system and people recognise that they have never managed to fix the entire national legal system, it's fundamentally different from the Westchester system. We think that we should abolish public defenders for the one person in Westchester who can't afford a lawyer, that was going to be your case today, then yes, this would probably be a very good case. Because we think that in fact we would see a very high level of public defenders within Westchester County. The income inequality across the United States makes this point moot. What we next told you though is they said this idea, you're going to change the prestige. You're going to change the prestige of the entire profession because now people are going to say, you're actually representing a good interest. This is mind-boggling. People are going to say, now you are no longer just representing the oppressed poor, but also representing the spoiled rich. Now the prestige of the profession of public defenders rises. This doesn't make any sense. We say the nobility around the profession right now is precisely that you are protecting the people who can't afford to protect themselves. Insofar as you're protecting someone who doesn't want you to protect them as a public defender, but has been forced to take you on and is really angry about it, we don't think that increases the prestige of any profession. Next thing they said though is it's like, they said it's the poor are currently being screwed over, and they said there are all these sort of examples of people falling asleep in trials and so on. And our onus today on this side of the house is not to defend the entire current public defender system in its entirety. We recognise that there are terrible public defenders out there. What they have to tell us on this side of the house today is why they're going to make the system any better. Because what Ben told you is you're going to go from having 20% of cases decided by terrible public defenders who are asleep to having 100% of cases decided by public defenders who are falling asleep. Insofar as they're providing us numerous examples of how terrible the public defender system is, we're not sure why they want to implement it across the entire nation. Okay, the next thing we heard was this idea, they said essentially, you'll get, this was fascinating, they said, well, don't worry about the money factor. They said, we can do things like debt forgiveness for law school students. And I mean, first of all, Ben pointed out, that's absurd when it's like, the opportunity cost is $10 million you could be earning somewhere else versus getting your debt forgiven. But we say, more importantly, that we think that these people can actually go into other professions. We think that these people are not just born hardwired as lawyers, never consider anything else they could do like go into business. We think this actually goes back a lot earlier than law school, when someone's in high school and is considering, I want a well-paid and respectable profession. Do I go and become a public defender who might get my debt forgiven, or do I go and become, like a business consultant, investment banker? We say there are a lot of these things people can do. We don't think that driving the smart people out of the legal profession is a good way to run this case. Let's then quickly go case side. What we heard was, we talked about this idea before, and they didn't really do that much to come back and defend their case. But Ben told you essentially that when it comes to this idea of asymmetry, that consultants can maintain this, that imbalance is somehow inevitable still in the system. Not that much of a response there. What they did tell you in response to this, this idea of rights, they said we curtail rights all the time. Therefore, we should curtail these rights. And gave the idea of campaign finance reforms. We say this recognises a few fundamental problems. First of all, there's not an absolute ban on campaign finance contributions because we recognise that there is a certain degree of speech and we might limit that but not ban it. We say furthermore though, that they don't ban everything else in the process, like the rich's control over the media, like rich's ability to pay people to essentially have more respect, have more word within society. Because insofar as recognising that people sometimes under very extreme circumstances do slightly restrict rights, show us today why you're completely banning them. What we told you furthermore was there was this idea essentially of you're lowering the standards across society. And said, no, you're going to maintain the standards. And again, fell back on this point of there'll be lobbying. We don't think you'll see that kind of lobbying pressure. We think the system has fundamental structural problems on these grounds without change.
First proposals around the speaks obviously 4 minutes, the arguments please.
three arguments. The second is plausibility, and the third is the idea of justice. That is true. The first idea of rights and the rights analysis that we get in the round, right? So first of all, we say on the side of the house, and we've said from the very beginning, that we recognize that there are basic rights in society, basic minimalistic rights that equate everybody. But above that, there's no kind of obligation of the state, nor is there even a right in the state to take away from what is like naturally earned above that threshold, right? We give you the example of a megaphone. Everyone has the right to basic speech, but we also can use a megaphone if we'd like to speak louder if we have the megaphone, right? Like if we had the money to purchase the megaphone, and that the state doesn't have a right to take away the megaphone in the first place. Here's the response that we get. Well, this is kind of silly because if the megaphone drowns out all speech, like if it's a super like lined up megaphone like The Simpsons, right? When Bart Simpson does that, and you can't hear anything, and in fact ears start bleeding and people die, right? Obviously, you recognize that this wasn't analogous, right? Because at least in the court system, the public defense attorney is getting up, he's talking, and most of the time he's doing work. The voice is heard. The only difference is one voice is heard better when it's heard because it's louder. They're not the same thing as completely being canceled out. So here are the analogous things that we give you, which they would also hope to rid on what sounds like a Bergeron-esque communist dictatorship, and you knew it from the beginning. Here, like the media, right? For instance, like the media also controls and dictates the livelihoods of everyone. If Hillary Clinton wins, a Republican's life will be very different. If a Republican wins, the poor Democrat who couldn't afford to actually express anything in the way of campaigning, his life will be very different. So yeah, the media also impacts life, just like the legal system does, right? Politics are also important. At the point at which one side of society, if richer, can better control that system too, they would also have to argue against this entire precedent that the entire media should either A, not exist and we should never express our voices, or B, that the media should also be state controlled. Silly ideas, I think, intuitively. But furthermore, they go down and they go say, well, there's no right to a specific kind of water, right? This is the good one, right? There's a river, and apparently in this river, one area of the river has spontaneously been polluted, despite the fact that rivers kind of flow. But another area is better, and there's no right to that better area of the river, right? So here's the question. Here's what they're saying. Not that we should somehow, all of a sudden make the river better or do some sort of other plan which allows, moving to two different rivers or multiple rivers, but that everyone should kind of congregate right here in the poisonous water that comes out, and that's why we get justice, right? Everyone's better off there. No real analysis as to why this helps the system. I'll talk about in the second point here about plausibility, why the system doesn't change anyway, and third, I'll reinforce what I just said as to why, in fact, it doesn't just not help the system, but kills justice. So let's move to plausibility first, this idea of why this isn't plausible. Now, they say the rich will have an incentive to fix the system once they're in it. But first, they've already tried, Lewis tells you, and I tell you in the first speech, this doesn't change the stereotypes which have made that effort fail in the first place. No good response. Second of all, we say that the rich recognize that they're always at a net loss. Even if they're somehow getting some money through this system, they're losing in the long run. What does this mean? You look at the point that I gave you in the very first speech, where we recognize that the entire system is going to be overturned anyway, insofar as the rich are already enfranchised to completely fight the system. The few millionaires they talk about as being so few and far between will in fact raise a ruckus and will in fact have the power to change things anyway, so you can't rely on the systems even being in place at all. Furthermore, we tell you that consultants are a very real reason why this urge of rich people to actually control the system will still continue. They only point to one of the two components, the individuals using the consultant. First of all, we would respond that sometimes some individuals are smart enough for this. But second of all, remember what Lewis says when he extends the point they don't respond to, that public defense attorneys can use the consultants through their clients, and they're confident enough to perceive the idea and make use of them. So they can't win this point, don't let a new thing come up. Then they say fixing things is happening, but when we say fixing, it is only easy in a homogeneous area like Westchester where only one person doesn't have an attorney. They've been proven why this will actually occur in places where the stereotypes are omnipresent. Finally, justice. So here they say that prestige is going to increase, and there's this weird contradiction. We hate rich lawyers, but somehow when we defend both rich lawyers and poor people as opposed to just the poor people, prestige increases because of the rich quality introduced into the mix. The strains of prestige was even on the table, but now it's completely off, I hope. And finally they say, well, what about falling asleep? On this side of the house, they wouldn't change the idea of falling asleep. They would just have both attorneys falling asleep, and it would be like the guy who drooled less on his notes who actually won the round, or in this case, the actual court system as a whole. We say there's no reason to believe that anything has ever changed. Justice actually is reduced in quality. We give you a good reason to believe that the quality and the overall number of lawyers is going to decrease. I think we've met our burdens. Thanks a lot.
Here, here, here. I just wanted to clarify something right at the beginning. So just because they're defending completely radical Ron Paul-style libertarianism, so much so that you could never cap campaign donations or ever have price gouging laws on their side of the house, doesn't mean that we must be defending broken Soviet-era style communism. Instead, we've instituted a means test that will actually draw an incredible amount of resources into the currently strained and underfunded public defense system. That means we'll have dramatically better lawyers for everyone. We've also been the only side of the house that's instituted any sort of plan for any sort of long-term efficacy. Now, Lewis, I think, tries to realize this as an MO and says, well, listen, we're not trying to sort of defend the incredibly screwed up stuff that happens all the time in the status quo. But that's entirely their advocacy. Their advocacy is, fuck the poor. We don't need to care about them. The only thing that matters is that the wealthy have the right to choose their own attorney, right? That's the entirety of their advocacy, and they haven't actually explained why our plan doesn't actually, is better than the sort of nitpicky ops they've given us about sort of how people might hire consultants, and now that would somehow sort of mitigate the enormous benefits that we're claiming on our side of the house. To that end, though, I have 2 points of crystallization I want to get into. The first thing I want to talk about is how do we actually get a better public defense system for everyone, right? We've talked about how the means test will actually allow us to have competitive wages for these people. I think this completely undermines your point about how there's going to be this max exodus, which is now premised on the idea that they could be getting $10 million paychecks someplace else. Like there's an infinity of those positions available to these people because they're so brilliant. They're nothing but the Dave Dens and Matt Wanzleys of the world. They'll be guaranteed to get these sorts of positions. Moreover, though, I think it's also important to realize that we do increase the prestige of this profession. Now, Pollard completely misconstrues the notion of the prestige because he says, oh, this profession is actually really prestigious because everyone just believes they're defending the people who couldn't pay for it. That's bullshit. No one thinks the public defense system is terribly prestigious. Instead, they think that it's either because people have incredibly idealistic conceptions of what the guilty people, what guilty people deserve, or they think that they're just slimy people who are defending the people who are already guilty. On our side of the house, we give these people a chance to defend the innocent, to defend the wealthy, to defend the prestigious in society, which increases the prestige of the profession and actually attracts more people to it. I think we give them the money to do these sorts of things and the ability to do these sorts of things. The only other response they give us is that, well, these people can go into another profession entirely. Right, obviously that's true, but I think we clearly make the system competitive. Moreover, though, if they actually believe their arguments, then they're certainly screwing over the poor on their side of the house. I think that's just an objective fact about the entirety of their advocacy. They're definitely harming the poor people, and it's not clear why the fact that the poor people are harmed doesn't mean that we should try to change the system in a way that makes at least the majority of people who are using it much better off. I also think, though, that it's significant here that they've never really addressed our argument about the sort of political will, where we get some responses to it in the MOC. What we tell you is that there's a significant case that we can, by tying everyone into the unitary system, we can generate the political will to change it and get long-term efficacy to actually resolve the sorts of abuses that are going on. The only real response here is that, well, the wealthy won't be willing to do this because there's a large hurdle. The problem is that, empirically, this is never the case, right? Healthcare in other systems, healthcare in other nations, when they nationalize the healthcare system, the poor were willing to change it. Moreover, public schooling in the United States has been improved in areas in which there are wealthy people bound in the system. Now they say, well, the Westchesters are better because it's just nothing but wealthy people. Yes, Westchesters is composed of no poor people whatsoever. That's simply not true. There are plenty of poor people in Westchester. The fact is there are also very wealthy people in Westchester who are bound into the same system. They're willing to make changes, whether or not they benefit the poor. I think that's particularly important, right? But the other real response we get here is that, well, the rich people will find alternatives, right? Now, it's true that the wealthy person in Sweden with the nationalized health care could fly to the U.S. every time they wanted to get treatment. But the vast majority of them don't. And so the vast majority make sure that they pay into the system, lobby for better systems, lobby for improvements in the status quo. Additionally, though, it just doesn't make all that much sense to spend all this money on consultants when they're, A, already spending a lot of money on public defenders because they're being taxed in accordance with these things, and B,
the idea of the rich not opting to use their money because of the ease of access is
All right, Jason clearly responded to this in the MT when he said it just doesn't make any sense when they already have to be paid into the system in order to use these sorts of things. Clearly, then they can be better using the resources to actually improve the system. But the only other response we hear from Ballard is his hard argument that the wealthy people have already tried. Yes, there are thousands of wealthy Manhattan socialites who are currently petitioning to reform the broken public defense system. No, the wealthy don't care because it's clearly in their interest to maintain the status quo, where they can evade prosecution by having really expensive and effective lawyers that pervert the nature of our justice system. That's a big problem with their side of the house. So I think we're clearly getting a better system. Moreover, I think we actually are the only ones who can clearly solve the sorts of abuses on their side of the house. Their entire advocacy is premised on we should just screw the poor. We actually get the long-term efficacy that we can use to reform the individual abuses on the ground. That's that's critical, and that's why we're waiting this round. But my second point of crucialization is this a permissible infringement of rights? And I think we have stood very clearly on the principle of equal access. We've got a strange conception of rights. Because people have rights to engage in a specific sort of behavior, they should have the unlimited ability to engage in a specific behavior. But that's not how we conceive of rights in a democracy. Instead, we think that everyone has the same fundamental equal access to use these sorts of rights. But when my exercise of an individual right compromises your ability to exercise your right in return, then we can permissively restrain the right. That's why we have caps on campaign financing. Because it's not because we recognize that there's some right to express, but we realize that above a certain limit, expressing more than a certain amount compromises the ability of other individuals to express those same self-same rights. They haven't actually engaged with us about any of the examples I gave in case about why we restrain hate speech or why we have price gouging laws. These are clear cases in which we infringe the rights of other people because the exercise of those rights is detrimental to the rights that people we believe are fundamental. We also have talked to you about the the real concrete harms that eventuate from this, and because they are so significant, we think that this means ultimately that it is worth infringing these sorts of rights because it harms everyone. We talked to you about how the poor get crappier sentences, and we talked also about how this is corruptive of the adversarial system, because the adversarial system rests on the simple assumption that each side has the same prima facie plausible truth value, and the only way for this to work is if both sides are balanced. The incentives on their side of the house point in the other way towards private attorneys prosecuting and getting people off, not necessarily finding the truth. They are proud and pushed by these incentives, and that's what the big problem is for their side of the house. They screw over the poor. That's terrible.